Hello everyone, today we talk about the settlement of the Longobard people in the Italian peninsula. You know that we talked about Longobard history on multiple occasions already, always, let's say, presenting the content as a foretaste of a further, deepening and expansion on the topic. You also know that recently we started another series two series actually, dedicated respectively to medieval Italy and medieval Germany to strengthen a little bit our content, our playlist on these topics. And you know that I also worked on Longobard history at some point, a long time ago now, but still with enough dedication to at least be aware of the main interpretational problems that historiographically and not that still historiographically sometimes are present, albeit in a minor way, but for the rest massively and renowningly debunked, right? Especially for the 19th century view of this world. Issues that have to do mostly with the integration of the Longobards within the fabric of the Italian population and the ensuing cultural consequences, and yet at a popular level, both from a multiculturalist and an ethno-nationalistic perspective, that naturally revealed their radical under education and mental underdevelopment in general. Certain myths, certain stereotypes, certain misunderstandings are always there, right, for ideological reasons, and in a complete moral disorientation on any ground that I can think. It's historical, political, moral, proper literary at some point. So every time I talk about Longobard history, I like to stress the correct historical view on this topic that is truly also possibly amongst the single most overlooked in the history of Western civilization, for reasons that already literally at this point perhaps this is the myth that the overwhelming majority of people fall in, whether they are, doesn't matter where they come from ideologically, but the idea that fundamentally the Longobards were just barbarians, and not just in the sense that, of course, naturally they came from a Central European reality that was less developed than Southern Europe, that came, as we will see today, in this darkest hour in the peninsular history, to which they didn't add actually much more of the damage that was already done, but on the contrary, since the very first generations, let's say, they immediately worked to structure a power that, without any doubt of sort, by any historiographical standard, is to be considered the single most civilly advanced Latin Germanic kingdom in early medieval Europe. And there is no doubt of the sort. If you have ever worked in Longobard sources, generally also what the situation of Spain, of Gaul, of Britain really was. You really have a pretty clear idea that the Longobards, by the late 8th century, the time of the Carolingian conquest, and we already addressed this issue actually talking about the St. Carolingians, were by far the most civilly and publicly advanced polity in the West. Today we do not talk about this, which is already something that, as I was saying before, sounds probably very strange, simply because nobody has had the interest to talk about this at a popular level, right? Most of these acquisitions are just historiographical. The experts write the books, somebody reads them, but also the market of books is not this dramatic much for medieval history, for the early Middle Ages, even less. Also, Italy is not, people don't really care about that. There is all a set of broader perspective problems that should be addressed before even starting to talk about such things. But in general, let's say, to my knowledge, no country in the world has interiorized this fact. And sadly enough, part of the reason is that what actually remained prevalent in these ideas is exactly the oldest historiographical approach, but literally the oldest, that is the 19th century one, that was not just ideologically bent to certain ideas. That's not maybe even the problem specifically, but it was properly wrong on a historical base. That is, there were certain things that even when they were written in good faith, there are also some cultural exponents. Think about Manzoni in Italy, who contributed with his literary works to spread an idea also of the Longobards, of the Franks, etc. He was even a good historian, but simply he was falling in the same mistake that both these things were mostly studied, as you understand, in Italy and in Germany, right at the time, and there was this attention fundamentally just for the beginning of Longobard Italy specifically, because of course the Longobards had a previous history too. And we shall talk about that at some point in detail. I wrote a thesis. Actually, we could make a video per paragraph at some point to go really in detail to see that, because also pre-Italian Longobard history is beautiful, but really beautiful. Even if we know a few about that, but the few we know is amazing, and it fits dramatically and astonishingly and surprisingly well with a lot of things we know about the rest of history, and that makes the Longobards actually an exception in the history of Germanic peoples, not only even famously known to any person who studied medieval law and Germanic law, that the Longobard law is fundamentally the single most important piece of information that we have on the customs of Germanic peoples. And even about that, we made a video actually about Germanic law. We didn't focus too much still on Longobard law per se, but we already highlighted certain aspects that are very important to understand, that are also very overlooked, and especially also substituted by ideological information, such as that there is a lot of ethno-nationalistic revivalism of the Celts, the Germans, as if these were some kind of of civilizations that other evil peoples obscured for their evil deeds. These are all I think it's like an autoimmune disease to believe certain things, but specifically in the case of Germanic people, sometimes these are presented as the forerunners of some kind of modernity, of equality. Total bullshit, right? That their societies was pure mafia. There was no other way to put this, and we know it basically by any kind of historical, archaeological piece of information that we have. And the Longobards, especially even, for example, the freedom of women, right, that of course were protected in a sense, but weren't free at all in the Germanic world. And still there are lots of people out there that for some kind of fashion, or I don't know what, that have to stress that these words were somewhat, the pure origin of which, people want to get lost into their individualistic delusions. I don't know why this is the case. I love the Longobards, and one of the reasons why I love them is, first of all, because I can't contextualize their history when they were still in a tribal reality. It surely was rough and brutal and violent, and but we must realize for what it was, right, and not believing that that's an invention, an historiographical invention. That's how it was today. We'll see how actually in the moment in which they settled in the Italian peninsula, the Longobards, as other Germanic peoples, did suffer of let's say an opposite press, let's say, in an anachronistic sense. But even in there, it's not the stereotype. This hasn't nothing to do with properly reconciling this with an alleged advancement or capacity that was otherwise there without the bias of these sources, because every source at the time was biased, and it's not, I don't know, the Romans' fault if the Germans didn't have a literature, but the problem here is that we have to and we do know historically how to contextualize that propaganda as well, right, to restore essentially an objective reality as it was happening, both in the crude but also actually in the positive aspects. And Longobard Italy is an unicum in every country, every people is a unicum in itself, but literally, given the range of Latin Germanic kingdoms, this thing is really far from the average of what happened, right? And actually, the exception in itself. And we could go on and on and on. You understand that I could digress endlessly about what even was the legacy of the Longobard Kingdom, for example, in the history of medieval law, and even for the same revival of Roman law, right? All the great work of civilization was carried out between the 11th to the 12th century, was carried out by Longobardists, by jurists that in Italy were, considering themselves as de jure Longobards, right, and that were now reviving Roman law, not to substitute it ideologically as it would happen, later in a broader universalistic fashion and towards the late Middle Ages mostly, to the law, but simply to integrate it to the local customs. There is really maybe too much, so I will try to. Now I will stop, I promise, and we go with a story here. But this long premise is necessary for one specific reason, that today we take a look actually at the hardest times in Longobard history, right? And this is not just about the Longobards, it's about Italy in itself, right? Even for the Byzantine areas, etc. The end of the kingdom was, in a way, also pretty brutal, as it could be, an 8th century reality. But it's still different because, as you know, the Longobard Kingdom was, due to its political, institutional, administrative, and juridical advancement, the only kingdom that the Carolingians preserved once they conquered, so that they would actually sum up the Frankish and Longobard crowns as rulers, right? And the Italic kingdom would remain the Holy Roman Empire, the single most important one, because without that you couldn't have the imperial crown. And that started all from that point, from Charlemagne, from his successors, and lived on, in fact, as such, properly as the Regnum Langobardorum, differently from realities such as, the Saxons or the others that were literally wiped out. And as in there, there was a complete, substitution due to, with Frankish law, etc. Here in Italy it was very different. But that's also another story. It's another story, the fate of the southern Longobard duchies that lived on until the 11th century, so the Norman conquest. And even Longobard law actually, I think, remained in southern Italy in the local customs until the 19th century. It's basically up to the Italian unification. That's somewhat overlooked, and actually a very sophisticated juridical science stemmed even in modern time, in the modern era, from it during times like it was still before the Enlightenment, etc. So this is the range of historical legacy that we should contemplate every time we even think about the Longobards. Secondly, today we will especially look at how, to make the long story short, the myth of this people as one of the most ferocious, if not actually and literally from Velleius Paterculus, the most ferocious, even more ferocious than the Germanic ferocity, as they were called, right? That they actually were at the beginning. However, began to display immediately as soon as he settled into this new reality in southern Europe. It had been the heartland of the Roman Empire, right? And so reflect on it. Began to display certain, attitudes that are actually very fascinating and very fertile from a civil point of view. It was no easy time. You know what the background here is. I think the single most debated, even if I don't want, because I didn't plan it, at least because I choose all my topics randomly, is Justinian's reconquest and all its effects on the West, on these provinces, and so on. So the Longobards are often perceived as basically the worst thing that could happen at that point that ruined everything. That's a very ideological and completely decontextualized and actually also morally questionable historical judgment. And what could be destroyed in Italy was done during the Gothic War, and even in there not because of the evil gods that surely under Totila carried out a scorched earth strategy, but for the sake of actually of the same, survival of their rule, and even contemplating something that would actually pair very much with what actually help the same Longobards later on. It is the freeing of the colonists, the end of the latifundium, of this terrible problem that used to be found basically in every of the Romanized lands of the Roman lands settled by the Germans. This was a problem that happened in Vandal Africa, in Visigothic Spain. It actually contributed, and to the same Ostrogothic Italy actually, it contributed deeply to the instability of the system, right? Because there was literally a Roman aristocracy living in parallel to the Germanic one, and the first wanted essentially to be reintegrated in the empire, where the latter wanted to establish essentially a continuity as a local reality. There were ideological tensions deriving from the ideals of rule. As we will see today, also religion was an issue, but not really a problem in itself, but rather a political tool that is often, also for the Longobards, grossly misunderstood and misportrayed sometimes, but properly without, you see, having known the sources, you see that there is none of that. This is you see, when there is an historical myth, normally there is something at the base of it, right? Here, there is just gossip at best. There is no structural systemic evidence of any of the main things that we think, are usually said the Longobards to have done. In a devastating sense, as a structural damage, right? This is instead basically the main key of interpretation. Today we will try to properly understand how the prejudice began, right, and how properly the sources do not show this, how we don't properly even know, and if there is no evidence, there is also no reason to take this, if not at best as an hypothesis, but especially considering many other indicators, properly the contrary of it, telling the truth. You know how the Longobards were called in some papal Byzantine letters that are basically the main information sometimes that we have about what was going on, because they didn't begin to write immediately, right? The Longobards were quickly Romanized, but accomplishing still something incredible, that was the political and institutional Germanization of Italy and its populations, which is something that lived on famously enough, even if you know certain pieces of medieval literature. Think about Liutprand from Cremona, the famous speech against the Byzantines, against the Romans, when he said this guy was essentially from a northern Italian that spoke a Romance language, but still he considered himself to be a German, because of all the people, because they were Longobards, and Italians would. This is interesting to even in a national perspective, because this is the first time in which Italy was starting to be called properly as a nation on its own, because of the Longobards. The Italians were known as Lombards to the Arabs, to the Byzantines, to the Franks. I mean, it was it. Right, and that's how deep the cultural impact of the Longobards, that were actually very few compared to the Italian population altogether, had managed to be achieved. And if one doesn't study properly what happened in Longobard times, will never understand how this was possible and how it was achieved. And in fact, that's where most of the misunderstandings came from, and some fantasy explanations had been found. And now we know they're wrong, and actually we also expanded dramatically, thanks especially to the great level of documentation for early medieval standards. Like the Longobard Italy left us a lot of charts, a lot of there was an extensive documentary practice, right? A high literacy and so on. So definitely something that goes against the majority of stereotypes for the early Middle Ages, and that in part also for this reason is not liked by those who want to push a certain narrative, right? For even, and unfortunately for ideological reasons. But anyhow, so the main problem we have to start from is that the memory about the Longobard invasion of Italy that is sedimented in the sources does evoke an image, a picture, right, a Longobard stereotype of barbaric ferocity, right, of devastating fury, of radical subversion, let's say, of the assets of late Romanity, right? This is true. Like, if we were to properly draw a line where, let's say, where does late antiquity end, and where, let's say, the Middle Ages begin, if we can do such, a brutal approximation, yes, definitely the Longobard invasion, however coupled with the Gothic War specifically, does mark this passage. The point is that it wasn't traumatic as we believe, right? One is the picture, and we have to understand who wrote these things. It was exclusively the Romans, fundamentally. And which Romans, by the way? Not the average guy who lived in the Po Valley, but, we're talking about high diplomacy between Constantinople and Rome, right? Which is a completely different thing. And that, of course, had enormous interests to think otherwise. I promise that we will make videos, God willing, on every, let's say, every of these steps that actually happened, including, I don't know, the double Byzantine-Frankish attack in the late 6th and beginning of the 7th century on the Po Valley, on the Longobards, on all the minutiae, even if you want, of political, nature, from a military point of view, also ecclesiological history. The fact that the Longobards, as Arians, were dramatically opposed to Catholics is another myth that is very hard, actually, to die still. And this was surely a different situation. We have to explain why this changed, because if we look at the sources that 80 years before had actually welcomed and represented the arrival of the Ostrogoths in the Italian peninsula, well, we see surely that there is a great distance. In fact, sources describe Longobard invasion of Italy in a very similar way to the Vandal invasion of Africa, right? Historically, say mythically, the Longobards and the Vandals, Vinil Vandil, or even the story in the Origo Gentis Langobardon, has this, the Longobards and Vandals as some kind of celestial twins in Germanic mythology, and they were probably kin to each other. And it's fascinating that they kind of maintained, even on the Vandals, there is a disgusting press. They weren't at all the Vandals, in fact, that we still call, as to look at, suburban thugs. And even in there is a specific reason that we also explain in part when we talk about Vandal history at some point. And even in there, it has to do with the Rome-Constantinople axis, right? For obvious reasons. The Vandals had occupied Africa. It was the granary of Italy, right? And if it hadn't been for them, the Western Roman Empire actually would have continued. And especially because of Gaiseric. But that's, again, let's not digress. So why all this? So the arrival and the settlement of the gens Langobardorum, as they were known in the sources, beautiful in this classicistic idea of the gens, right? Not specifically a Nazi, but a sort of broader frame of clientelary reality that was surely very complex in nature. And while we'll talk about the ethnic origins, surely had a traumatic impact on the Italian ruling class. That is to say, the reconquered Byzantine Italian politics and administration. That, as you know, had actually suffered also because ideally Italy should have been taken like this, like with a snap. Actually, Belisarius accomplished the thing. The Byzantines eventually screwed everything up by, beheading the military command and, all the mess of the Gothic comeback. That is what effectively destroyed Italy. That in all this, by the way, remained still uninterruptedly since Roman times up to the late 17th century, the richest per capita country in the world, right? And this per capita is very important because it would help dramatically the Longobards, right? There are lots of analogies to this, even in a very different reality, but in terms properly of wealth distribution with Anglo-Saxon England, right? Let's leave aside that Longobards were also a bit Saxon, or at least there were some Saxons. There is some genes to be found in Longobard burials in Hungary, in Italy, that are similar to, show genetic material that is similar to English one. And that's not surprising, actually, together with lots of things, right? There is even kind of Polish genes. There's some Slavs were present already among the Longobards. But aside from this is the main problem that triggered all the propaganda. It was the only political instrument available in those times. That is, the Longobards would start their own propaganda, the Merovingians had their own propaganda, the Arabs would have their own propaganda, the Anglo-Saxons had their own propaganda. We cannot say, looking at history, it's all a conspiracy because those guys said propaganda. Like, you're an idiot if you think so, because the entire historiography at the time was propaganda. So you can't say, no, there is something hidden truth because there were the good people who didn't use that and those with it, right? That's dumb. And so dumb as to ignore, in fact, what properly the main evidence, right, the single most important political and social change that the Longobards invasion brought actually was that the Longobards beheaded the Roman ruling class. It was a very different ruling class to the one that had existed before. You see, if the Longobards had migrated into Italy by the time of Theodoric dead, things would have gone very differently for a number of reasons. First of all, because probably also the same Longobards, just like the Ostrogoths, were actually called into Italy. And that's the other myth, that Longobards were fundamentally entering alone, as if, nobody had called them. There is no actual historical proof of this, but considering the fact that Longobards had been Roman allies, and still there was an evident anti-Frankish function of the whole plan of reconquest, etc., the settlement of the Longobards in the Po Valley was surely mediated. An indirect proof actually would be that when the Longobards migrated into Italy, there was no finger moved against them, militarily speaking. The Byzantines kept doing whatever they wanted. In Constantinople, things were fine. The imperial mobile armies didn't move. The Longobards were let being settled, right? And it's not just because the Italian resources were exhausted. Yes, there was no way to oppose them in that sense, but surely if the empire had wanted to oppose the Longobard rule, preventing the invasion or countering taking it out since the beginning, they could have moved, right, in that order, right, because it was a big thing objectively. The Longobards were also many. Was possibly the largest, just like the Ostrogothic migration. These are the largest of the migration era demic movements, right? The Longobards were many. Were not so many as, let's say, they were something between 1 to 3% of the Italian population altogether. They didn't settle everywhere, but they left an important ethnic mark, especially in certain areas, such as the northeast, like Friuli. That was also a less urbanized reality. The Longobards there harbored, a longer, warlikeness, also because the Slavic frontier, etc. In the Apennines, because these were strategic areas, where also Gothic communities actually remained after the Gothic War, right? Just like, in Bundle Africa, etc. The Byzantines had simply left certain farmers slash colonists slash garrisons of Germans remaining there, and making them, their own men, basically. Famously enough, certain towns in northern Italy were garrisoned by Goths, opened the gates to the Longobards, right? Even in here, there is no evidence of violence carried out, of systematic destruction, devastation. There is none of that. Even archaeologically speaking. Even the siege of Pavia, the 3-year one, it's a myth. Seemingly it never existed. That's just a medieval chronicler that wanted to copy essentially the 3 years siege of Ravenna by Theodoric against Odoacer, so that Alboin should have been done the same with Pavia. But there's no evidence of that. Archaeology doesn't tell us there were devastations, fires, whatever, nothing, none of that. Also, it would be pretty dumb to destroy a land where you have to settle, right? One thing is, I don't know, when the Vandals were just crossing Spain and they knew they wouldn't stay there, they would ravage and make a wasteland, yes. But when they settled in Africa as well, there's no evidence of destructions. Because it doesn't make any sense by any logical standard, right? More of that to come. Rigorous knowledge of the Italian peninsula, because they had fought in there for the Romans themselves during the Gothic War, as you know. So the idea that the Longobards didn't come to Italy by imperial delegation like the Goths did, right, must be put in perspective, in the sense that at the time of the Goths, Italy was a functioning state with a powerful Roman aristocracy, with the Ostrogoths having all the interest of maintaining in full work. As you know, the Ostrogoths basically made up the army. They left all the civil administration in the hands of the Roman senatorial families. When the Longobards arrived in Italy, this thing didn't exist anymore, right? And to presume that the Longobards would have at that point, to carve a functional power from a non-existent latifundium structure, and therefore, simply, squeezing into the rest of the population without taking over the few, hierarchic structures that had remained, is also not very logical at the same time. And we will see how, when we talk about the ruling class, we have to think of people that at that point had in the hands the administration of the resources, right, of the populations, etc. We'll try to explain this better, because there was a specific harmony, syntony, let's say, between the Longobard cultural view and especially political and social organization with what the Gothic War had left Italy like. Right, remember Totila that promised to the Romans to be freed and to become free Germans, basically, to the Italian colonists if they had fought for them. He had joined the Ostrogothic army against the Byzantines. Does it tell you something? Well, this is exactly what happened. Even if the Byzantines had won the war, the latifundium had gone destroyed. There weren't the great, powerful families that owned a rich latifundia that still troubled the local rule, as it would happen in Frankish Gaul and in Visigothic Spain, or even Vandal Africa. Here, the Longobards were terribly facilitated in their task, because they found a society that they could essentially assimilate quite quickly in their own, in their own proper, as it would be more evident later. We don't have the proof of imperial delegation for Longobards settlement in Italy, but also if you look at the broader scale of documentation of those times, it would be actually not surprising that we don't have that, as long as lots of other things. There is also more of a legend, and here that is the Narcissus one. The idea that since Narcissus was kind of triggered by the fact that he had been stripped of power, he called the Longobards in Italy. That's also nonsense. Narcissus was given public state funeral in Constantinople, and that doesn't happen for somebody that calls the evil barbarians into a Roman province without permission, right? So that's pure myth, story, has nothing to do. We don't have to think that the Romans were so happy about having these guys within their boundaries, but still, Merovingian threat was a serious thing. Remember that at the same end of the Gothic War, actually the Franks and the Alemanni had taken the opportunity to launch a raid into Italy, devastating it up to the south, where they were, however, crushed by Roman arms. It does make sense to want to settle these people in the Po Valley, at least. That was, at the time especially, not a particularly advanced compared to the center and the south, but would remain for at least another half of a millennium fundamentally more advanced than the north, at least in terms of actual wealth, then the distance was not that far yet, because especially under the Longobards, the north and still part of the center rocketed by early medieval standards, right? But still it was an important transformation. The Po Valley had fundamentally remained unhinged from the great Mediterranean traffics, right? Tuscany was directly connected via Provence to Central Europe, right? They didn't pass through. But still, importantly enough, in the Po Valley, there were some of the largest cities in the Roman Empire, like Pavia, Milan, Verona, were all occupied by the Longobards, not surprisingly. The first being the capital, specifically, of the kingdom, were literally the largest cities of the empire, together with Constantinople, Rome, Aphrodisia, these cities, but Italy had the largest ones. But traditionally speaking, it was the most urbanized land in absolute terms, in spite of the decay of the cities. And always remember, the Longobards ruled from the cities, something that the Franks didn't do, right? In the rest of Latin Germanic Europe, the administration was much more of a rural thing altogether. The Longobards maintained, since the very start, their direct control in the cities. There's no other way. Italy, differently from other countries, was a place where every single part of the countryside was connected to the city. It's not like in France or in Germany that for a great part of the Middle Ages there is literally the world of the forest. That is, people that lived cut from any urban net and just having their own life. Italy is connected everywhere through cities, via roads, all these things, and don't think that the general decline here means anything. The infrastructural impact of Roman rule in the Italian peninsula was something massive, and that would greatly facilitate, even had facilitated already, Ostrogothic rule that was ruling properly a Roman state. The Longobards were ruling now the ruins of that, but still, hell of ruins. And they would have not migrated from, the Pannonian Plain to a worse land. The main Longobard problem, there was a problem for everybody at that point, where the thing got really messy, is that they weren't properly, as most Germanic peoples, properly anything like a kingdom, right? The Goths had initiated, essentially by Roman creation, the monarchy in the Germanic peoples, right? Germans had what the Romans called reges, right? As chieftains of some consistency, etc. But famously enough, right, Germanic culture was anti-monarchic by definition. The same Longobards actually had traditionally probably the single most popular political culture among many Germanic peoples. They had a very strong middle class, so much that it would manage actually to create essentially the only functional elective monarchy in the history of Latin Germanic Europe, which is not also to be another huge myth is that Longobard Italy was fragmented by duchies that fought themselves. That's another total bullshit. That's probably the worst that can even be told, because Longobard Italy was the single most unitary Latin Germanic kingdom at the time existing, right? The fragmentation in duchies was non-existent politically wise. That is to say, the only duchy that actually created some minor problem, because it wasn't even that relevant, was Spoleto in the center, because it was surrounded by Roman territories and wanted to make their own business. But even the south was actually fine. They recognized the monarchy when it was created, and there were even southern kings that were brought into the north. And there was nobody who, after Authari created the kingdom, contested the kingdom. The Longobards were under a king, and they were okay with that, because they had traditionally elected him, and this election and the fragmentation is non-existent. There were never wars between a duchy and another, right? The worst could happen is that in the far south, like Benevent, one duke would be not liked by the king of Pavia. There would be a military campaign. It would simply enter the city, establish a new duke, and coming back, and nothing else, right? Also, the division between Neustria and Austria is a myth. They had the same political and strategical interests, right? This is a myth deriving essentially from the latest Longobard history, where basically the kingdom had become a papal Frankish protectorate, till basically with the very last king, Desiderius, and the Austria in northeastern Italy basically said, okay, that guy's been appointed by foreigners. We are instead the true Longobards. We don't recognize him. That in the very last years of the kingdom. Here we're talking about basically 2 centuries where, after the initial anarchy, the kingdom was created and nobody contested it, ever, right? There was maybe somebody who said, I don't like that king, I will fight against him, but then I will become king and rule still, and everybody would accept that rule. There is no evidence of any kind of this ducal fragmentation. That's a myth, right? The ducal anarchy lasted 10 years, okay, from 574 to 584, in a context that now we will see here, but that has nothing to do with what lasted until 774. I care particularly about this because these are things that doesn't matter how much you repeat, you will always find the data that has to say, no, it's not true. Study history, right? Buy books, study them. That is not Google things on the internet. No, you have to read, learn, and study things. There's no other way, right? And you should also study sources, because that's where we get also books from, in case you don't know. So the main problem of the Longobards, actually, as we were saying, is that at the moment of their migration into Italy, they didn't know a proper monarchic institution. The Romans had favored the rise to power of the family of Alboin, fundamentally, that had fundamentally managed to catalyze through their victories against the Gepids, and sometimes, turning also against the previous Roman allies, the fantasies, the dreams of conquest, expand of the people altogether that followed Alboin into Italy. Alboin is a very famous figure in the even late. If you look at the north side, he's remembered as a great hero that accomplished, such as Dietrich von Bern, like the Theodoric of Verona. They're great heroes of Germanic epics, and so this guy managed, through his charisma, his consensus, his warlike capacities, to bring the Longobard people more or less all together. Actually, some groups would arrive later, etc., but to enter Italy. As we were saying, we know nothing about whether they were still considered as federative, the Romans had, because they had actually turned their arms against the Romans at some point, but the situation was so fluid that we would tell the thing. So, as a consequence of this, is that being Alboin just a chief, a leader, right, conventionally recognized as such, and the local, and the Longobard dukes at the head of the clans feeling still, however, free as a free people, the Longobards lacked a proper political cohesion, a unity of command. And so the mess happened because as soon as they migrated in the Po Valley, where the bulk stayed, however, lots of others began to swarm into the rest of the peninsula. At this time, the Longobards didn't even have a geographical understanding of for example, the unity of, for example, the Italian peninsula. Some would even cross the Alps into Burgundy, where they were massacred by the way. Others began to swarm in the south, but autonomously in these groups, the Fare, as they were known, from this Gemeinschaft, essentially, that is at the base of the migration Germans that are essentially logistically autonomous clans that go whatever they want, right? And in fact, in Italian toponomastics, there is still a lot of Fare because of all the memory of these Longobard groups that settled here and there. So we already talked about, recently we made a video about properly the Longobard invasion of Italy from a Byzantine perspective. So we have outlined there all the boundaries of the very complicated kind of not irrational because there was a logic behind it, but say very fragmented, let's say settlement of the Longobards, especially in the center and the south of the peninsula. We don't know certain areas. This was a floating border, right? The whole Italy was turned into a border, let's say, along the Apennine line, and certain areas where the Longobards eventually would gain the upper hand. Today we don't look at the specifically military events, but there were certain wars specifically that marked eventually the Longobard victory. That is to say, at least the Byzantine recognition of certain territories that they had seized, and the fact that the Longobards were the stronger, they had the upper hand, right? And gradually, if it hadn't been for Carolingian invasion, the Longobards would have conquered easily all Italy, including Rome, where they had already, penetrated factionally, politically. History might have gone very differently at that point, but this is another story. Let's say this settlement was also probably more organized than we think when we look at the possibility that some Longobards were actually already present in the peninsula before Alboin's migration, because it seems that, especially in Benevent, where there are some Longobard administrative titles that are very Latin in terminologically speaking, might have actually been settled by Longobard mercenaries, Longobard troops that had served under during the Gothic War, right? That's very fascinating. We talked about this. I think we made a video on the on Langobardia Minor, as it was called, the southern Longobard duchies, fundamentally that had this. In fact, apparently more kind of even let's say more immediate political control by the side of the dukes and their territory, right? But what happened fundamentally is that the dukes settled in all these various cities along the Apennine, and in the Po Valley they occupied almost the whole area. They established their duchies in the cities, right? They immediately began. We know, even archaeologically speaking, that maybe the first generation lived separated by the rest of the Roman populace, and eventually, it was just the city altogether under Longobard control and with a community consensus. Remember that in Italy, the Roman city never dies, right? Epigraphically speaking, we know that the same municipal pride that that existed in late antiquity is living on in these local families that arrived to to be the nobility of the communal age, maybe not directly, but as properly as in terms of social status, etc. And the Longobards keep it alive, of course, and they make also very good use of cities from a strategical point of view, because they manage fundamentally to entrench themselves into them when major offensives arrive from the Byzantines and the Franks, and they manage to retain control. Right. Speaking of the infrastructural importance, even of a Roman city wall, or the walled city was the walled territory was dotted with cities there. Surely. So, what about the loot and the devastations? Because some of you will say, well, but there still was, like, certain areas. Think about Monte Cassino, for example, were destroyed at some point. There was, that is true, but is that because the Longobards were ferocious animals that destroyed everything they found because they were stupid, uncivilized barbarians? No. That is something that happens because, surprise, surprise, there were still Byzantines in the territory. And if the Byzantine is held by the territory and the Byzantines are hostile and they make war at you, what do? You make war at them. Also, the Byzantines raised towns to the ground to make a scorched earth strategy at some point. The Longobards did the same. So going to loot into the next territory, was normal, right? When you come back home, you don't loot in there. So it's normal. So surely the Longobards invading Italy wanted to loot its riches. They wanted to establish forcibly on their territory. There's no doubt about this. They did it, right? They seized control, as we'll see now. But they didn't destroy the places where they settled. Right? Maybe they destroyed one place at some point they couldn't hold. Maybe, 100 years later they managed to retake it. That's another story. There were also specific destructions carried out. I don't know, Rotary in the early 7th century conquered Genoa and razed its walls to the ground, but there were some, political and strategical, reasons for doing that. It wasn't because, they had a weakness for destruction, let's say. That was the practice of early medieval warfare, and not just of that one, right? In case you didn't notice, we increasingly, become destructive as civilizations as we grew. It is true that the Longobards were one of the least Romanized barbarian peoples. This is absolutely true. They had scarce contacts with the Roman world in previous times. They entered Roman radar towards the end of the 5th, to say, beginning of the 6th century. They always occupied either lands of the Barbaricum from Germany. They rose up essentially the Elbe Valley. That was their main route. They settled in Moravia, then eventually in Pannonia. So these, even if they had been Roman lands, from on the right bank of the Danube, territories like the Pannonian ones were fundamentally very superficially Romanized, and by that point also they actually had a very scarce, Roman. There were Romanized populations among the Longobards when they migrated into Italy, for sure. There were lots of other peoples. We know of the Longobards were fundamentally German. There is no evidence that somebody wants to say that they were something like a Sarmato-Germanic people, right? It's not because you fight or look like, militarily speaking, like a Sarmatian that you are an ethnic Sarmatian. Surprise, surprise, human beings can learn to do stuff, and not just by breeding with other people. And there were surely Sarmatian elements, say, but the fact that these were so large in these people that had remained fundamentally just into Germany at that time, doesn't matter how much the Huns had pushed the Iranians towards the west, etc. It still doesn't tell us basically anything about what the Longobards were about ethnically speaking. From the genetic samples we have, we see they were prevalently Germanic, right? They were essentially Elbe Germans. They were akin, also linguistically, we know Longobard was beautiful in sound. It was hissing. It was evil, right? We know, from their art, they had a psychopathic, the typical. It's the same thing you find in the Germanic, in the Norse side. This world dominated by people, with scattered limbs of human beings and primordial, universal snakes that devour. That's the mentality from which these people came from. They were similar to the Alemanni and the Bavarians in part. I mean, the Bavarians were a bit of a mix, not properly a people on their own, but there were Swabians by adoption. There were Thuringians. Agilulf, Duke of Turin, would become, as Longobard king was actually of Thuringian origin. There were Saxons too. Actually, were lots of Saxons during the first migration, but the Longobards to Italy properly. But the Longobards wanted to assimilate them, to make them become Longobards, because they had a weakness for that. Doing that, as we will see, the Longobards tended to assimilate all these other groups. But the Saxons refused and came back to the Elbe. There are still some, the Longobards had not migrated entirely. There are some Longobards had remained in the lower Elbe basin, and they were eventually essentially absorbed by the Saxons later on. There were some Slavs, surely. We know they had arrived at the Longobard boundaries in Moravia before the migration. There were surely Avars, other Turks. There were Romanized, Celticized populations, as we've seen. There were lots of peoples among them, but the multiculturalists, you see, ethno-nationalists are a bunch of imbeciles. Multiculturalists are fundamentally the same thing, and since the latter usually prevail, at least in historiographical perspective, they wanted to stress that these peoples were so mixed you couldn't even understand who they were. Actually, no, right? First of all, because there were many, but because they usually joined all together when they knew that one people was migrating into one place, and the union makes strength. But in terms of the actual core of the people and where they moved, and there is no evidence they were so mixed. the Longobards passed for globetrotters, but actually they weren't. They literally, took like 300 years to move from the lower Elbe to, to Moravia and the Pannonian Plain, and that's still Germany basically. They didn't move much at all, right? Even if in later times it is true, when after they migrated into Italy, many of them actually swarmed into, they became mercenaries en masse in the Byzantine army. Yes, at that point, yes, but it has nothing to do with the previous times. We find thousands of them employed by the Byzantines in Armenia. We find them rising to important command posts in the Balkans against the Slavs. There are lots of interesting. There's a tomb of Longobard adopted Swabian, became one of those important commanders in Ravenna. There is its grave, Byzantine Ravenna, of course. And so, in general, you understand that the Longobards hadn't received much of, external change. In fact, even archaeologically, the first settlements in certain areas, certain huts, etc., we see that they were typically Northern European style built, right? Yes, they were mixed, but we don't have to exaggerate about that either. And it is true that the Longobards of the first hour, let's say, of the first generation, let's say, that settled into Italy, they were something very peculiar. Like, they were surely attached, they were extraneous to Roman culture. They were rooted in their traditional tribal values. They were essentially pagan warriors, right? If you go in the Museum of Cividale, you find graves even of horses. You realize these were horse archers. They had roamed the Pannonian steppe, the westernmost branch of the greater Eurasian steppe, right? Their armor at some point was identical to everything that was worn from Hungary through the Bering Strait. They had been surely very influenced by those military styles, but so they were basically everybody in the migration era, right? Procopius, remembering the employment of Longobard warriors at the money of, in employment of the empire against the gods, signaled their particularly warlike nature, right, and more, let's say, rougher and more wild customs compared to the ones of the other barbarian gentes, right? The Longobards thought differently from this. Actually, they in their memory thought that they were, because you see, during the Gothic War, the Longobards had been sent out of Italy by the Romans because they said that they committed, some atrocious massacres in that case, because at that point they were mercenaries, they were fighting in a foreign land, they didn't give a damn but about loot. So yes, they would commit some of the worst atrocities you can imagine, as all mercenaries at that in any time in history. Also regular soldiers do it. All the time. There they had learned, though, what Italy was like. That was very important for them. Paul the Deacon remembers instead that Narses had sent the Longobards away with gifts, because they had been so good. Yeah, we can. It's interesting how opinions diverge about that, but still, it's meaningful because the Longobards did fight throughout all the war that they fought also to Tagine, and that they had. They were considered a bit unreliable indeed, but as other mercenaries in general. As it was full of foreigners in the Byzantine army at that point, and those were in for the loot most. Was a way also to economize for the pays and so on. But that's another story. But the Longobard memory was present in classical sources. Velleius Paterculus, since the 1st century AD, remembers the Longobards among the Germanic peoples as the more ferocious of the Germanic ferocity. It was said that when Tiberius had conquered Germany, he had crushed the Longobards, were extremely, ferocious, and that drew. Tacitus says that they drew prestige and honor from being at war constantly with all the surrounding tribes. You don't want to be the Longobard neighbor. The reason being apparently that there were a few, but for this reason they increased their metus hostilis, to react against the enemy, to be ready, militarily speaking. There were Wodan's adoptive sons, according to the story. famously enough. They had this specific warlike military mindset that surely stood out after Arminius was killed, assassinated by the same Germans after his accomplishments against the Romans. It seems that even even if they were a small tribe, the Longobards had risen for a few times as basically the judge, let's say, those who kept things in order in Germany. It's remarkable. Then we know a few. We know the Longobards had participated to the Marcomannic raids into Pannonia they had been defeated in Antonine times. Then after that we don't know anything about them basically until they came back in the late Empire on the Danubian frontier, but were probably always around those areas, mostly centered, however, in the Albasan, but still, going, their comitatus, their war bands going around, surely fighting. Surely Longobards were present also at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. There's not much of a doubt. It was, everybody would join of these, and they had surely, as we were saying before, also a pretty obscure mindset, and as you can imagine, living in the Barbaricum it would be very interesting from a psychiatric point of view to analyze, because frankly, if you have an idea of how they lived and what was the level of political instability and of threat and competition for resources, you realize we talked about Germanic warfare, even the Berserkers tradition, the Ulfadnar, that the Longobards were also some, famous representatives of, even in their founding myth. That's not very settling to read in the first place. So, historiographically, though, by repetition, let's say, the Longobards had already arrived in Italy with this solid long fame of being peculiarly, let's say, barbaric among the barbarians. So this was already not a good presentation for anybody who already could capitalize on this past to say, oh, look at, if they are our enemies, look at the fact that they've always been those barbarians, right? This was used, in fact, propagandistically to actually point out the only true violence that is witnessed to have been carried out by the Longobards in the occupied territories. That is what exactly? Well, these are fundamentally ecclesiastical sources. These were Catholic, so essentially the papacy, right? It was denouncing, often to Constantinople, what the Longobards were doing to the Italic Church, specifically, because as you know, in this late antique, dying late antique context, bishops and fundamentally bishops were the new senators, right? Were the new administrators, those who literally even had soldiers and controlled the land and had this huge, amount of estates. At this point, dramatically reduced by the Gothic War, but still, around which, also the communities would gather, organizationally, etc., because these men had the power. So as we were saying before, what the Longobards were accused of were actually to have attacked the church, and specifically the Roman aristocrats in general, right? So these are the only sources that we have about Longobard violence out of a military sense, where violence is the only thing that exists by necessity. So it's obviously a denunciation, let's say, of a reality that surely existed, right? Very frequent are especially the relative hints at the expoliation of churches and monasteries in the sources, they say, accompanied by assassinations, tortures, and other injustice carried out against the clergy specifically. And these sources motivate such aggression with the aversion that the Longobards, that were basically still Arian or pagan, would have felt against Catholic faith, right? But this is like a 6th century Catholic source that is saying These guys have come to these places. They have seized basically our own churches. So obviously we're depicting these guys as the terrible heathens that kill and murder and whatever. But just the clergy. That is to say, these sources do not say that, peasants were massacred, whatever. You may say, well, but maybe they didn't care. Well, they would actually care, because that would have actually served even better to the propaganda, that is to show the other people, the people who still lived under Byzantine papal rule, that, look at those monsters that kill. But as we've seen, it makes no sense. Demographic resources were especially what the whole economy was about. You don't conquer a place that is already depopulated by war and plague, and you start killing people. What for? Those are peasants that can work for you. Those are people that already live in, advanced reality by early medieval standards. There are farms, there are cities, as we've seen. There is literacy. There is something functioning still, right? What do you do? Why would you kill those people? Of course they didn't, right? And it's pretty much obvious that the Longobards would actually expoliate ecclesiastical foundations, because these were the places in which at the time was concentrated the much, at least, of the wealth, and also, let's say, weaker the defenses were, right? This is not yet, the full Middle Ages, where monasteries and even churches sometimes were literally fortified, right? This was still a civil reality that, in the absence of a local military that, as we've seen, there was no mobile army to intervene in Italy, would be easy prey of these conquerors, right? We surely seize that amount of wealth, right? But to do what? To actually start ruling from there in their stead. So the sources actually are very spot on. These looting is directed towards ecclesiastical centers, towards the aristocracy. The Longobards didn't care to become enemy with the rest of the population. There were too few. As we've said before, 1 to 3% of the population, right? You live in a pre-industrial society. You don't have the coercive means to control, to be 1 or 3 and to control the other 97 out of 100. It's impossible, right? So you need them, on the contrary, to rule. That is, there's never been a moment in which the Longobards didn't have the support of the Italian population, and we know it for many reasons that, as we were hinting at before. The first one is that these Roman aristocrats, even if strongly depleted in their power by the war, were still representing the rule over this essentially colonist/servant peasantry that hadn't liked at all that state of things, and had actually already been more sympathetic towards the Germans in Ostrogothic times, in their kind of mentality of every man is a freeman, fundamentally, that had been challenged by the same Gothic elite at that point, because they wanted to become like the Romans, right? As well, and oppressing, and there was a process like that of oppression also of the Germanic middle class. This would happen in part also in Longobard times too, because new elites were formed along the way. As we will see, not particularly powerful, like in Gaul or in Spain. That was one of the reasons, actually possibly the single most important factor, in the creation of a publicly and civilly and administratively and juridically functional kingdom, an elective monarchy, when you don't have civil wars and, local magnates taking over, making rebellions, whatever. None of that, right? Compare Italy and with Gaul and with Spain in early medieval times, and we'll see what it was like. Wickham, famously enough, wrote about these things, and he's quite eloquent about it. This phenomenon brought naturally to an abandonment in front of danger, of incumbent danger, of many episcopal seats. That is to say, many bishops, knowing that the Longobards were arriving, they fled. And interestingly enough, yes, we also have evidence of inhabitants moving from the diocese to the new seat, right? There are the most important examples are, for example, Milan, where many people fled to go to Genoa. And this is important because new dioceses were properly formed, in this way, or Aquileia to Grado, right, are much closer, but they are, and in fact, they would remain, one in the hands of the Longobards, one at the end of the Byzantines, right? It's not that the population fled because they didn't want to live with the Longobards. These were clients of the bishops that had all the interest to maintain, a post under episcopal rule, and that would move in these other places. But for the rest, there is no evidence of mass emigration from Roman-held areas because the Longobards were arriving. On the contrary, actually, we have very eloquent letters from Byzantine administrators and bishops specifically, actually, in Byzantine papal-held Italy, that complained about the fact that lots of their own inhabitants were fleeing into Longobard territory. Because, why? Well, because there was, in Longobard Italy, was much less tax pressure, right? These people wanted to be Longobard subjects and not Byzantine subjects, and they left. Here, we should digress so much in explaining concretely what the differences between the urban areas, the countryside was about. The overwhelming majority of people lived in the countryside, right? And this is also another important factor historically to realize that most of the sources we have are from the urban elites, right? So exactly the places where the Byzantine rule remained for a longer time, right? That were marginal. The majority of the Italian population lived in the hinterland, that is, under Longobard rule, and that's why the Longobards eventually took over, right? And the Byzantines were reduced to the coasts, because it was a support. You don't go anywhere if you don't have the majority of the moral force of the local people in order to rule. There is no way. And that's also why those areas actually were they remained actually under Longobard territory rule without coming back, right? Once they were occupied by the Longobards, even if that at the moment we can presume there was instability, there was war, the Byzantines surely didn't sit ducks completely. Garrisons normally entrenched themselves into, it's over some mountains, some islands, etc. But sometimes there was not even war even in there. Eventually things ran out smoothly. We have evidence in the Insula Comacina, for example. There was a Byzantine garrison that I think held out for like 20 years, like was in the middle of the Como Lake, if I'm not wrong. And the rest of the lake shore were in Longobard control. They weren't even at war, right? Just held there, they exchanged, they traded, whatever. Then after 20 years, they said, okay, well, it's over. Let's simply, finish this. And no blood was shed. That's literally the picture we have to realize here. So there is no single evidence of a terrible, invader arrived and taken over and oppressed. None of this from any source. On the contrary, we find, I think it's an early 7th century source. I don't remember which one it is, but it's a very laconic one, but that is saying, so early 7th century Europe, so in theory the darkest of ages, so the most terrible things, whatever, that simply says, what, literally, it's positive that the Longobards are here, because they give us stability, because there is a political unity, there is a functional, there's justice, this is it. I think it's a northern Italian source. And what can you say about this? This is what we know. So it's like also for the religious struggle, right? This is true even if you study Vandal Africa or Visigothic Spain. You see that history manuals say, there were religious tensions because there was a part of the nobility, mostly the Germanic kind of party, let's say, and that were always mixed, however, that was more pro-Arian, that they wanted the more, that they were against the Catholics, and instead were the most Roman-like. When you study who these people were and what they did and what was their role in politics, you realize that basically they didn't give a damn about each other's religion. It was just about who had to control the land that religious factionalism was about. Famously enough, with Spain, the councils of Toledo are in a nutshell fundamentally the cause of the decentralization, let's say, of the lack of public culture in Spanish, in Visigothic Spain, because it was the Hispano, let's say, the Visigothic landowners that basically took over public authority. The same basically happened in Merovingian Gaul, where the Merovingians began to kill each other, and the nobility took over. Why? Because the estates there had remained intact, right? Instead, in Italy, they had razed to the ground. The wealth was way more evenly distributed, and therefore the Longobards had it easy, because they didn't have any major magnate that would complain and take over, right? An average Gallic magnate was richer than a Longobard king himself, that was basically the largest landowner in Italy, and in Longobard Italy at least. And therefore there was no competition. The only aristocratic struggle was for the public office and career, right? This would happen later. Here now, at the moment of the invasion, here we skip the chronological perspective because it took a while to form that. It began fundamentally with since the 584, then the institutionalization worked, especially in the following generations, and it was successful, right? But it worked like that, and that's the actual evidence that we have. Other areas, however, so the Longobard Kingdom would mostly develop historically as basically the Po Valley and part of northeastern Italy, Tuscany, Liguria, so certain other areas, but whereas those would remain specifically ever more under public control. That is to say, the ducal power decreased, especially in Lombardy and Tuscany, that were the most productive areas, and would remain even historically in Italy. Think about the Middle Ages. I mean, that's pretty evident. There is a Longobard legacy in that, in public administration, in urban culture, whatever. The rest of Longobard Italy was instead something much more tormented, it is true, because it was much more militarized in a nutshell. As we've seen, northeastern Italy was on the Slavic frontier. There were small areas. They were not dramatically populated either, but still they maintained a way. The Apenninic area, right, this became fundamentally in a endemic war zone. Right, for a long time, there wasn't the alternation and passage of control of the territory from one side or the other, right, the Byzantines or the Longobards. Considering all this, that Byzantine Italy, we made videos about this, was essentially ever more forgotten by Constantinople, right? Byzantine Italy began to take on a physiognomy that was also ever more similar and homogeneous to the Longobard one, right? So the countries evidently like a peninsula. They are connected with each other. There is no way around this, right? It's in the westernmost province of the empire. It's, as we've seen, it has local wealth, so there is an enormous degree of autonomy. Even the properly called Byzantine principalities, if you pick the same Rome, right, or there was a duchy technically, but also those would become maritime republics like Naples, Amalfi, etc. Those were de facto independent, right? So, of course, they were connected to Byzantine affairs, that they invested in them, etc. But properly foreign Byzantine presence was reduced. And the major Byzantine power was actually the Exarchate in Ravenna, that also became increasingly autonomous from Constantinople. So, even in here, we don't have to think for the other side, the Byzantines. So, okay, the Far East, right? It was still basically the same country, and surely, also Longobard Italy had an important development, as we've seen economically. So at some point, especially towards the end of the kingdom, the blending of properly the Roman territories and the Longobard ones would mix together, right? Whereas the Roman population, as we'll see in a while, had already become Longobard de jure. There was no way out of this as well. We see in these more tormented areas definitely many episcopal seats that became vacant for a long time, they obliged the Pope to intervene in an ever more Italic dimension, especially also after the Islamic invasions that cut out contact with Africa and so on. Papal policy took ever more an Italic trend because they were threatened by the Longobards themselves. The Longobards besieged Rome multiple times, never took it, but still they could. Even in early times, Agilulf did, Aistulf did. And so there are all problems of ecclesiastical administration. For now, Skip will make videos on these. So the myth that this is a very important, that the Longobards had a somewhat anti-Catholic bias is actually difficult to state in the first place. So why is this? Because as we've seen, they were namely Arian Christians, right? Albeit the common Longobard would fundamentally be a pagan with their ancestral beliefs. We don't have to think like 6th or 7th century Italy like a place, especially in the countryside, where the majority of the population was like, people knew the Bible or understood Christian religion. That is a myth, right? Christianization fundamentally had spread in the Roman Empire, mostly in the cities, right? And the Christianization of the countryside, by starting from Italy, by a great civilizational work of men like Gregory the Great, think about even Saint Benedict, so all these aspects that properly reflect the decay of cities in relative sense, and the importance of this countryside that, as we've seen, was winking ever more and actually being supportive of the Longobards for these very political reasons. The church had began to push a bit more in the countryside, but the majority of the people was what these people care, what the church cared about, as we explained many times, was not that all people actually were true Christians, that they would actually understand what Christianity was. I mean, not even the French nobility in the 13th century understood what Christianity was concretely, even if they were completely Christian at that point. I mean, completely in the sense that there was no ambiguity whatsoever on their creed, but still, they thought it in a way that is ridiculous on a theological base, right? Also because paganism properly as a set of, as a view of life, as a set of knowledge, as an understanding of what has no chance whatsoever against monotheism. That is, culturally speaking, it's like an extremely primitive thing. It cannot compete with. It never did historically, right? It was never like paganism competing culturally with Christianity in medieval times, right? The only evolved paganism was, the one of the great civilizations like in the Roman Empire in the East, etc., where, in fact was ever more enotheistic, ever more towards a monotheism at the end of the day. Whereas, Longobard paganism was something that we know also survived traditionally very long, but together with Christianity, that is to say that these people were namely Christian themselves. We find crosses everywhere in their burials, even in the pagan fashion that, as you know, fundamentally disappeared in the 7th century because they, as full Christians, they stopped burying people in arms and with precious stuff, which is completely normal, because for a pagan mentality, Christianity is just another thing you have to put into the cauldron, right? Because it's magic, right? It makes you, win stuff, and, it's apotropaic, all these things. And so the myth that there was kind of an ideological opposition to Catholicism here doesn't find any evidence, because we know that the Longobards, we know it from archaeology, we see it, that after the settlement in Italy, the first generations immediately, began to blend. They began to, we see it, the women, as always happens there, they were the first ones to actually adopt the Roman fashion. Christianity, even in here, was felt differently given their background, but they didn't even see the subtle differences. What did they care about Arianism or Catholicism practically? For them, it was just about, the cross. That was a magic object that could protect them, right? Surely there were differences. They were perceived. But these were mostly at an elite level, right? Because the elite there was fundamentally an extraneous body having created a kingdom that was between essentially two fires, that is, the Merovingians and the Byzantines, that were both Catholic powers that had tried to take them out. So the Longobards, by retaining Arianism in their elites, would basically make an international shout-out to say, you know what, we are still this, because among the various things we disagree on, we have to, to force the difference to say that we are still Longobards, that we do not become subjects of the church, that we are still independent. The Longobards had a great sense of themselves. The Longobards were very respected by all the other Germanic peoples because they were the only ones among eventually those who turned civilized that didn't wink at Roman imperial symbolism, right? Whereas, the Merovingians, the Visigoths, basically wanted to become kind of Roman in imperial ambition, and did things like the councils of Toledo were essentially a copy of the ecumenic councils of Constantinople, competing with that. And there is all an imperial culture in Iberian political culture, reality that is astonishing. The Merovingians too. The Merovingians had basically forsaken the Germanic background in favor of the Roman Catholic, Gallo-Roman elites, specifically of Gaul. Right? They were still Germans, they were still the Franks, yes, but they had become kings after having beheaded literally under Clovis all the other Germanic chieftains. So doing something astonishing, even in there, because the overwhelming majority of people were Gallo-Romans, they weren't the Franks, even though, especially in Austria, yes, there was some, speaking of Gaul, because Austrasia is basically Germany, there was an important ethnic impact even in there, but fundamentally they had stratified the population, and they had, given up any kind of... Instead, the Longobards maintaining this kind of idea that, after all, there was an equality, that also the monarchy was elective, that properly, there was nothing Roman about the Longobards, right? That the same Romans were properly assimilated as Longobards juridically, always earned the utmost respect, especially of the Franks, that thought essentially of the Longobards as their only peers among the Germanic peoples, because they recognized their greatness, their advancements. And another very important thing that the Longobard Kingdom did was to properly establish a territorial horizon of the people. That is to say, an Italian one, right? It's just with the Anglo-Saxons, they had to be emperors of all the British Isles, right? I'm not aware. I don't think the Franks I think the Visigoths did. The Franks didn't quite, because they didn't consider Gaul as the geographic. The Longobards did. The Agilulf declared himself in the early 7th century, Agilulf gratia Dei Rex Totius Italiae, right? And the Longobards had only one thing in mind: conquering Italy, right? And that made a lot of sense for many reasons. First of all, because the evident geographical unity of the peninsula. Secondly, its wealth, right? And its broader strategic location in the center of the Mediterranean, etc. Third, the fact, and this is often overlooked, that the Byzantines were still there. So obviously, in a situation like this, where you moved a few tens of kilometers in the Apennine, you were in Byzantine territory, then you were in Longobard one, etc. Claiming kingship all over the geographic notion of Italy was a dramatic political shout-out at propaganda, because they declared right away that their objective was to unite all the peninsula under their control. Even though in all this, the Longobards did maintain their own deeper values. That their warlike culture, we see it even in certain realities. Longobard Italy is very well documented for early medieval standards, but still not so much in absolute terms, of course. And we see that this warlike customs were still there for a long time, that this society had altogether adjusted alongside the standard of the Germanic freemen, right, the Arimanus for Longobard terms, and that in this context owned a modest land property, worked. We know it's a prevalently agricultural reality, right? It's a poor world still by our standards, of course, but this had also some vitality. It had a functional justice. It had a political stability. So it was an era that developed, framed under civil rule, and it was particularly important because other areas of Europe didn't quite have this. Right. For example, I don't know, Germany grew up in a completely different way. There was no such thing like a public authority, for example. We were talking about that when we made that video about Conrad the Silent by the 11th century, right? The Longobard tradition of the civic one properly that developed into Italy. And as we'll see here, Romanization was important because it's not that the Longobards were not Romanized. They were deeply Romanized. They spoke Romance. Right, Longobard extinguished, but they were Germanic by political and institutional identity. That is remarkable, right? Italy was free tradition. At the turn of the millennium, by the 11th century, the communities of the Italic kingdom were regarded to be free. Whereas if you went, I don't know, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the majority of people were essentially servants under a lord. This is a huge difference, which is also, it brilliantly contrasts with the bullshit that, the Germanic society were free, right? They weren't free at all. As we were saying before, that was mafia, nothing else. These were lands instead where they had, the Longobard Kingdom, there had been properly a civil development, right? Written culture, public authority, central power, cities, traffics. That's civilization. So there is also this national attachment the Longobards had to their tradition that is to be found in the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, that also mixed some kind of pagan with essentially Christian elements. The Longobards, as you know, had received their name and their own group identity by Woden, right? And they had consecrated themselves to it. They had even adopted historically this ritual hairstyle that distinguished it from the other peoples. They were the Longbeards, from which their names. Long hair essentially opened in the forehead in two bands falling on the cheeks, and the back of the head, the nape, completely shaved, right? And this hairstyle that is loaded with precise cultural and cultural meanings was reproduced also at the time of Queen Theodolinda, who was Authari's first and then Agilulf's wife. She was Bavarian, right? At the beginning of the 7th century, she had these beautiful frescoes that were lost, but they were realized in the royal palace of Monza, right? That Paul the Diacon in the 8th century says that at this age were still visible. Theodolinda is a key figure because the Bavarians essentially were Catholic, even they're barely so, but still they had chosen Catholicism because they were essentially a Merovingian emanation, so they had fallen into Catholicism themselves. And she was very important because she married into the... She was married by Authari, king of the Longobards, who was Arian. Then she married Agilulf, who was Arian. And King Agilulf, aside from, think about Saint Columba, these were the patrons essentially of an important work of evangelization, also, in a broad international sense. Theodolinda was very important because she began to open to Catholicism. As a Catholic, she had beautiful correspondence with Gregory the Great, important reapproaching of the Longobards with the papacy. That is also another thing that is actually pretty famous historically if you know Longobard history, but it's not very often portrayed. Basically, at that point, having Byzantine power shrunk and having also Frankish power shrank, well, the popes had, and the Longobard power increased, well, the popes had understood that they had to also negotiate with the Longobards, right? And this had loosened the tension regarding to the formal confessional divide, so much that Agilulf and Teodolinda had their son baptized according to Catholic rite. Agilulf was still Arian, bear it in mind. And it began actually a phase of harmony with the papacy. What is often forgotten is that even in certain problems that the popes had with Constantinople, the Longobards actually sided with the papacy in an ecclesiological way. That is, the Byzantines at that point were doing tribal, they were doing acrobacies, let's say, to keep their eastern provinces under control, and therefore granting all the kind of heterodox but not openly heretical stance to them, right? And in the West, the Latin Germanic word said, "What the hell are you doing?" That is to say, we often say in a medieval perspective, yes, the popes betrayed the true Orthodox religion. Well, yeah, in the 11th century, yeah, the papal monarchy invented something completely new. But if you look at the early medieval times, the actual weirdos were the Byzantines. And the same Longobards, still, when they were still Arians, they actually were backing the Pope in, think about the Tricapitoline Schism, in saying something that was obviously, correct from a theological point of view, and the Byzantines were just trying to, for needs that they had objectively, very, very politically concrete too, as well, to trying to enforce those in the West, but unitedly failing, because, as we often said, this Western area of Europe was the Latin-speaking one, let's say, was taking another direction. Right, well, the Latin Germanic one, let's say better. The Latin Germanic one was taking another direction, right? The Orthodox and the Eastern areas were taking another one. And the relations between the Longobards and the Pope were, for most of Longobard history, actually good. They were actually good. There wasn't this myth that the Longobards were terrible fanatics that wanted to crush Catholicism. There is no evidence. Right, by the 8th century, the Longobards were perfectly Catholic, by the way, just in case. Even in here, older historiography looked at the beginning of Longobard settlements in Italy and the end of, basically Carolingian conquest, where the papacy was writing like crazy that these were monsters, they were heretics, like against any enemy of the church. It doesn't matter what kind of belief they had, right? The terrible impious Longobards depicted in in papal letters to Charlemagne were pious Catholic Christians that didn't give a damn about any kind of religious controversy, to start any religious controversy whatsoever, because it was useless, right? It was a way of stabilizing the kingdom. The Longobard Kingdom, since the 7th century, becomes unequivocally and unavoidably Catholic, also because the majority of the population was Catholic. And as for many other things, there was no way the Longobards could maintain, even if they had truly believed in that, which they didn't give a shit of object at the beginning of the migration about Christianity. But because properly they didn't take seriously even paganism by themselves. I mean, it was just their way of living. The paganism doesn't require a deep belief. It's just, even Christians had their beliefs that were non-Christian at the time, but were still Christian, right? So, nobody was touching those aspects, right? This was a matter of saying public, internationally, are you Arian, are you Catholic? Of course, they would prefer to become Catholic, like everybody did. Like any Arian in the West eventually became Catholic. There was no survival of anything, as also no survival of paganism on the long run. There is a specific reason. And no, it's not because the popes were there, trying to burn everybody who said otherwise. It was because simply it was an intelligent and sensible thing to do. Consider that, as always, like if you're listening to me for the first time, aside from having a pretty hefty medieval Christianity playlist on this channel. We treat Christianity as it was essentially a reinforcement of the administrative and civil, capacities of local authorities. That's it. All this process was fundamentally spontaneous. I mean, the one of evangelization. It was the same peoples that realized that, the church with its administration, its territorialization of power was for, especially here we're talking about, already civilized areas, but let's say talking about Central, Eastern, Northern Europe, that gradually it was the same local elites that welcomed the creation of a society based on those patterns, because it's simply, how, things improved through historically. There is actually also, aside from the church, some mention, as we were saying before, of attacks to properly aristocrats, to major landowners, like the few ones that had remained. Paul the Deacon is a very fascinating source. Paul the Deacon is the most important source for Longobard history. He was a Longobard himself. He lived in the 8th century. He was connected with the family of the Dukes of Friuli. He had the first fought against Charlemagne, then eventually, actually went to Charlemagne's court. Then he retired to the monastery of Monte Cassino. He was a proud Longobard as much as he was a Catholic priest. So his narrative, his Historia Langobardorum, which is beautiful to read, by the way, has naturally fully received the idea of the path of civilization that the Longobard pagan people had made through evangelization and the creation of the Catholic kingdom that at that point ruled over the peninsula. Paul the Deacon is a fascinating source because he surely knew a lot about the tradition. The oral tradition was very, what the Longobards actually came with, and then they put in written form when they arrived to Italy. That's why also they were so important, actually, because they did it very early compared to other Germanic peoples. And they had a fresher memory of that also in their law as well. That's why it's so important in Germanistics, the most important legal collection. With Rotary and his continuators, as kings, of course, always. He knew a lot of that, and we cannot check these voices because they were oral. Also, he probably invents other aspects, there is no doubt. He's an early medieval writer, so with all the pros and cons of it. And naturally, he has this narrative of improvement of civilization. And it's also realistic if you think about that, because surely the first Longobards, before uniting in the kingdom under Authority, when they were under attack from the Byzantines and the Franks, surely, as we've seen, didn't have a notion of what they would have become properly. Some of them would oppose, the creation of the kingdom at the beginning. Authority literally beheaded all of them. And therefore nobody complained anymore for all the 2 centuries to come. So Paul had to stress himself the idea that there had an initial barbarity, right? He reminds expressly the massacre of the possessores, so the landowner, the owners altogether, taken place principally in a decade of so-called ducal anarchy. So that parenthesis after Alboin's and Cleves, his successor, assassination between 574 and 584, in which the Longobards did not elect another king until Authority. So that was the mess, where, as we've seen, there was no king. The dukes were carving their own powers around, Italy, and obviously dispossessing the local landowners to take control. The Longobards, we know actually at some levels, imposed to the Romans the payment of the tertia. That is, in the logic standing behind the hospitalitas that had been the usual mean of settlement in the Roman Empire since Visigothic times, right? Basically, what happened is that the people settled in a place with Roman, permission. Here it's interesting because, as we've seen, we don't know whether it was Roman permission or not, but it probably was still mediated with these local communities in a way. And the occupants would seize 1/3 of the lands. Historically, this to sustain themselves, because the point was that these federati were settled in order to make up the army, so they had to sustain themselves with some wealth. Historically, as long as it was a functional Roman state, had happened not by actually grabbing the land, but in some cases, yes, of course, it was the public one, the one of the fiscus, that was seized. But let's say the private owners wouldn't be touched. It was mostly about getting the annona, right? And the money was usually, or it was also already in nature sometimes, of course, that served to pay for the army. At the time of Longobard invasion of Italy, we can imagine that this thing was much less mediated. That means that the Longobards literally seized directly land, right, by right of conquest, and killing and showing the owners, and which means the owners. That is to say, as we've seen, the free property, let's say, was not still there. There was still this remnants of Roman latifundium, right? So what would actually happen is that there were a few, these leading families would be taken out in a way or another, not even necessarily killed, while the peasantry obviously remained to work the land. As we have seen, it's a simple question of maths. The Longobards couldn't fill demographically the gap, even if they had massacred everybody, right? So they obviously wanted the peasants who were there to keep working as they had always done, right? In a situation in which we don't have to think that the peasants didn't actually help them, right? Because the peasants, as we've seen, were anxious to actually get rid of Byzantine administration, and these landowners were mostly connected with that. So the Longobard arrival might have actually been welcomed even by the masses of colonists/servants to say, okay, let's actually have these ones as rulers, because they are bringing together with them a completely different view of what public power should be, right? It's not based on the huge land owning. And probably this, as we've seen, was already so much in crisis that it would have melted away by itself. We know this happened also in other lands. For example, in pre-Anglo-Saxon England, it seems that even before the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, the peasants had basically rebelled and completely redrawn the land plots, etc. So there we literally know nothing because it's underdocumented as an area. But something similar here might have been mediated by the Longobards. That is, we have no evidence of nothing like a revolution, whatever. The Longobards actually were interested in maintaining the same power that the ancient owners had. But still, they were doing it from especially in this moment of ducal anarchy that we have seen, without a superior power that demanded more wealth. You see, the Byzantine administrators of Italy would have to send some resources to Constantinople. A local duke that was settled with his clan and had to rule this local community while it was threatened also by Byzantine reconquest, of course, didn't have to squeeze this community excessively. They just wanted to maintain safe, stable control on it, but still, investing for the same interests of this community, as we've seen, not falling again under Byzantine rule. And this was these people's interest at the end of the day, as we have already seen. And in fact, it's meaningful that many dukes didn't accept the demand that Authari made when he was elected as king in 584 to give a part, properly of the royal fisc that basically corresponded to the hospitalitas quota, right, to the monarchy, to the newly created monarchy, right? That's where many of these Longobards now actually sided with the Byzantines while remaining actually in control of their own land. So it was a very blurred, fluid situation, as you can imagine. Authari probably fought more against other Longobards than against Byzantines. But he managed to impose also this measure. So even in there, actually, that's what not necessarily a bad thing for the peasants either, because this was the first step of a process that would gradually strip the dukes from a too tight control in their own communities, right? And it would be the first footstep of royal public authority in the Longobard Kingdom into ducal possessions, right? And if you know we will talk about at some point the dual political, administrative, juridical development of the kingdom. The royal authority would create essentially a copy of Pavia's palace in every duchy, and that would represent literally and physically royal authority there for the local communities to denounce any abuse that the dukes would carry out against Longobard law to the population. So that would be also an important balance to prevent that dukes would increase too much their control of land as landowners, right, in Longobard Italy, which in fact didn't happen. And this means in practice that condition, let's say, of proto-feudalism that was already formed in Gaul, for example, in Italy didn't happen. That the average freeman was actually freer, right? Exactly because the power of aristocracy was stamped. And you understand in this regard that this was a hell of a good place to live in, right, for the average person, for early medieval standards. And yes, if you look at the West, basically, which other country had it better? Basically nobody, right? As we have seen, Gaul, for example, was richer altogether at this point than Italy. Also that, as we've seen, the Longobards didn't occupy it all. But the average freeman was not was not richer, nor freer, in fact, as power was concentrated just in the hands of very few. So this also tells a lot, right? And consider that by the 8th century, the 9th, 10th, that these lands take off economically. That is, Italy has a lot of transactions of revival of trade, of monetary economy, etc. That tells about a lot of vitality at a local level. It began in Longobard times, right? It was proper of the whole Western Europe, but there had its highest development, together actually with northern France, that however happened there through nobiliar, entrepreneuriality, let's say, that so squeezing consistently the local populace, right? Whereas this was much freer, right, from properly an individual base. We actually know that properly people were freer, even women that, as we will see by Germanic law, were not independent because they were always under the male tutor, right? Who actually enjoyed a great autonomy, economically speaking. They often inherited certain goods, right? In testaments, they were free to use them until they died. None of this is to be found, I don't know, in Germanic societies like in Scandinavia. Like, their social roles were dramatically more strict, right? The fact that they were less regulated doesn't mean that they were more free at all, nor that they lived better at all. So that's why also these realities are so disgustingly overlooked, right? For reasons that are very ugly in today's popular culture, and that tell so much, not just about ignorance, but properly ideological viciousness, and a certain kind of bias that we should hopefully completely get rid of altogether. Surely the Longobard conquest of Italy brought an end to Justinian's restoration. That is, all this new regime was something indeed completely different from what late antiquity had been, and that had entered in crisis long before, right? The latifundium aristocracy that the Justinian restoration had wanted to reinstate in the peninsula failed. The population did this. The Longobards rode the wave. They realized that if they fought against that model, they would actually get the favor of the local population, and they got it for good, right? Hence also the thing against Catholicism. No, it was just about part of the ecclesiastical aristocracy that functioned alongside the Byzantine pattern. They didn't want that to happen again, right? So this is very important to realize. And many people say, well, but then, senatorial aristocracy did not participate in the administration of the new kingdom like it had happened, in Gothic Italy, for example, or in Frankish Gaul, or in Gothic Spain. Well, this is partly true, because naturally that system wasn't anymore. But as we have just said, this wasn't Longobards' fault de facto, right? It was already like this. The Roman aristocracy was shrinking, even in Gaul, even in Spain, everywhere, right? The Longobards didn't have the means to revive it, nor the interest of doing it. However, we obviously know that there were Romans that were working in the Longobard administration. Guess why? Because the Longobards didn't even know how to read or write. Well, this is the point. The whole administration that had remained standing naturally needed educated personnel. We know of Romans of these. We know that there were Roman elites, right? It's just that they were much more modest in nature. As we were saying before, 90%, 7% of the population in a highly urbanized area for early medieval standards was still there. We see life in the cities. We see aristocracies. We see some education. We see something important. Of course, the Longobards that mostly ruled from this area of Lombard, in fact, it takes their name. Essentially, it was the triangle, Pavia, Milan, Monza. These were the most important centers, which is, well, very important centers of late antiquity, of Romanity, especially Milan. Milan was a great center of Romanity. Well, we find there, of course, that an administration was created. The Longobards had a palatium regium where they administered from. They wrote, they produced documents, they issued laws. What were these laws? Written in Latin. The Longobards produced, under Rotary in 643, this incredibly important juridical work that had a tremendous success. We know that this law was used for centuries to come, even after the fall of the Longobard Kingdom, because it was so wired to the reality of the kingdom that was used by everybody. And guess what? It was in Latin, because it was not for, say, Germans, right? As we will see now, they weren't isolated from the rest of the population. They were assimilated immediately. Right, we find some interesting, fascinating Germanism, some Germanic word even, but in a completely Latin text. There was also a simple Latin because it had to be understood by all these, as we've seen, fundamentally middle owners, modest owners that, were interested and required that law. And we know that this law circulated. We have documents from tribunals. We have beautiful juridical, we have material, we have inquiries. We know that the Longobard public authority was present on the territory, that made things work, that controlled the frontiers, the properties. It was effective, efficient, right? And there was properly a net of administrative fabric that functioned actively, and that was controlled by the king, right? Not by someone else, like in other countries happened, uniformly on Longobard territory. So this is really remarkable, right? So when people say, okay, well, but, it's a bit dead summer, these last Roman names that appear in the administration, well, what do you expect from the late 6th, early 7th century? Like, what do you find, like, yeah, maybe in Gaul you find still certain names because the local bishops were basically the descendants of the local senators had remained. But what was public authority functioning like there? It was a freaking mess. It was all private. the Merovingians were basically a Frankish kingdom did not exist anymore. There were 4 different kingdoms, always warring with each other, and the rest of their possessions were always, was expanding autonomously, privately, and so actually this system the Longobards created was truly the most effective, and the Romans did participate to it. In fact, for the Roman small landowners and the peasants, the Longobard settlement was surely, painful at some level. There's no doubt. It was still an invasion, right? But as we've seen, it probably had not serious consequences relatively to their life conditions, right? It is true that sources render it rather complicated to evaluate certain aspects, because naturally, looking at a rural reality in the early medieval times is almost impossible. We don't know much about it, especially in actual, information, not just from a geography or from metaphors or whatever. But fundamentally, as far as we understand, the peasants simply saw the new barbarian masters substituting to the old Roman masters, while the small landowners simply kept paying their own cannons and services that, due to the imperial fiscus, that had been much more meticulous and oppressive in the collection, as we've seen with the same Byzantine subjects fleeing into Longobard territory for this reason. So actually, it's fair to state that the Longobard invasion didn't bring to any major change into the social fabric of the Italian population. There is no evidence of this whatsoever. Certain areas turned into war zones because they were border areas, but the Po Valley, Tuscany, other important centers remained untouched by this. There were wars. There were the Byzantine invasion, the Frankish invasion at some point, but this was just in the late 6th, beginning of the 7th century. For the rest of the Longobards were always on the offensive, and they didn't suffer innerly of any invasion or intrusion or things like that. So we can say that once the initial political instability and violence had reduced, the daily life of the Longobard subjects basically restarted in the same ways it had been before. And actually, it's even possible that Longobard government, as we've seen from those sources, actually brought to a greater stability in many areas that it had been also in Roman times, right? If you want, the same fact that that Italy could be easily penetrated by a Longobard invasion or by those Frankish Alemannic raiders in Roman times speaks for not much of a great strict grip that the Byzantine government had on this land, especially in the north, etc. So actually, in many cases, the Longobard settlement was beneficial actually to great stability. They replenished the army. They to control the situation. They began to properly have a territorial control. That was there to stay, right? So this was perceived evenly. And as we were saying before, also the Romans that lived in the cities, right, had been represented or organized by their own bishops. In spite this part of these bishops were removed, still with the new ones had an even greater capacity of contracting with the new rulers, right, the terms of coexistence than the peasantry, and naturally this brought them on the fore, as we've seen, for essentially the participation to Longobard administration, right? And also, now we will pass to the properly of the ethnic question, that is, because it's not because you don't see Roman names, it doesn't mean that these were different people. As we've seen, there was no ethnic substitution, right? Certain lands in Europe at this point had gone completely depopulated, or almost, of course, they were resettled by other peoples. Italy was still heavily populated. As we've seen, these invaders were numerically inconsistent. In the broader picture, right, aside from certain areas, also Italy had gone depopulated in many areas. So actually, as we were saying, in fact, especially in the Apennines, etc., it was also an ethnic impact. We're still seeing today in Italy there is a concentration of higher percentage, I don't know, blue eyes or blonde hair in Longobard settled areas like the Friuli, for example, or Spoleto or Benevento, right? It's like they are islets that are distinguished properly statistically from the surrounding, because that's an evidence of a Germanic settlement. So, not surprisingly, and not just the Longobards, by the way. This may have been still relics of the Italic migrations of the north of the Goths themselves, that, as we've seen, also basically became Longobard. This is the point. Everybody there became a Longobard. How? Well, let's give a look to it. So, in the 19th century, and that's what we were saying before, it was believed that since in Longobard sources no Roman name appeared and Roman law was not contemplated, that basically the Longobards had arrived and had completely subjugated everybody else, and just the Longobards did things, and the Romans were just hiding, scattered somewhere we don't know, right? This is very unlikely, if anything, as we've seen also from a numerical point of view. This was seen because at the time it was a lot of ethno-nationalism, because, I don't know, the Italians wanted to stress that the Longobards were the evil German invaders, the Germans wanted to stress that the Longobards were the great winners that had taken out the Romans, so all this bullshit. Of course, this is not true. It's the complete opposite of what we know, actually, from an historical reality. This basically went as simple as this. There are certain considerations we could make in an articulated sense. For example, the word differences on the basis of social contexts, for example, the dichotomy city-countryside, whatever. But the point is the following, that in a few generations, every subject of the Longobard Kingdom became juridically a Longobard. This is fundamental to understand, because we could talk for hours and hours to endlessly what it meant to be a Longobard, because you see, you don't have to think that even when, I don't know, we mostly start seeing this from 643, because it was the time when Rotary's edict was issued, and therefore we start having a better picture of what Longobard Italy was concretely, right? But we don't have to think, as we were saying before, that, for example, when the Longobards arrived in Italy, there was, let's say, a uniform Longobard identity that was created in here, was essentially exported with the same characters by 643. No. The Longobards are actually possibly the German people with the oldest ethnonym ever. Like most of migration era Germans had a new name. That is, there were the ancient tribes that created a new name to go on like a federation. The Longobards were always the Longobards. That is, according to the myth, when they left Sweden, they arrived in the continent, were adopted by Woden, those became the Longobards, and we have Roman sources from dating to the conquest of Germany under Drusus and Tiberius that say that there were the Longobards. So they are that old, and that's an exception, right? That's remarkable, and it's remarkable that even if they were small people, they survived with that ethnonym. They were probably very warlike. They probably literally fought their way through and survived in a way or another, like most actually Germanic tribes wouldn't, right? So the Traditionskern, this survived indeed, right? It was very strong, and it surely had an impact even in Italy. But let's say that the new Longobard identity that we start seeing with the Edict of Rotary, etc., it's obviously something that is more inclusive than it had been before. That is to say, now properly every subject now can recognize itself as a Longobard, right? It was almost 80 years from the migration. These were the third, the fourth generation, right? So at this time, we see that the Longobards, materially speaking, they had blended. Their art changed. They became Roman fundamentally. Their clothes were Roman. Even their burial rites were becoming Roman. There was a Catholicization. So basically, by Rothary's times, we have to properly understand that the same law was properly issued to properly enforce this uniformity, because it was dramatically functional to the government of the kingdom in itself, right? If everybody's equal under that ground, right, on that ground, you can more easily administer the thing. This doesn't mean that there weren't things like serfs, half free, as we will see, or slaves. This could happen also legally. You could become a slave because you had, I don't know, killed somebody or stolen something, or you couldn't pay to the compensation, right? So there were probably also slaves purchased from abroad. This was normal, right? We know that there were prisoners taken in Byzantine territory. There were also slaves. Obviously, there was manumission. You could free the slaves, and those would become Longobards. That was actually a very ancient thing. Also in the Longobard myth of the origins, there is this thing that was done, right? The slave touched by the arrowhead that becomes to fight as Longobard, that wins its freedom and becomes a Longobard, is included like that. That's how the Longobards probably also made it through that hell of Barbaricum, because they managed to reintegrate the losses in battle with these new elements of societies that were, essentially first, gradually integrated through these passages to become a full Longobard. So the Longobards were not stranger to inclusion in this sense. It was a necessity, right? And especially when a territorial power like the Longobard Kingdom is created, it's something naturally very different from what happened north of the Alps, where territorial control was practically non-existent. That is to say, the people was always conceived like on the march. They occupied certain areas, but they could move, etc. Here now there was a rooted sedentary administration. It was a completely different thing, and with all the other population to cope with, right? So in the Longobard perception, the freeman was provided with full rights and political capacity. He was known as the exercitalis in Latin, as you understand. Here, the thing is also Latin. The language now is Romance, right? There are, as we've seen, Germanic derivations like things or gyrothings, other words, etc. But because they didn't know properly how to translate it in Latin at a certain level, so they thought to integrate it into the Latin text as they knew it. But properly, the same Longobard language by the 8th century probably was extinguished, right? And in any case, the prevalent one had always been Romance in the kingdom. So exercitalis means the men of the exercitus, the men of the army, right? Or arimannos, right? That basically would be Hermann, right? So also from which the broader Herr, Ger, man, spear, the identity, that hence also the name of Germany comes from, right? Hermann, the man of the arm, right? That is to say, the adult male that is capable to bear arms, and it is also the member of the assembly, that is the things or gyrothings. You see gyre here, the spear comes back because the things is the assembly. Here, the assembly of the spears. In fact, it's a tribal custom. The Longobard kings were still romantically said to have been elected through the shaking of the spears, like Tacitus speaks for the ancient Germans, right? So instead, the free Longobard subjects that didn't bring arms, such as women, for example, found themselves in a condition of owners of more feeble rights, say, given that they had to stay under the mundium, that is, the protection of an adult male. So also orphans, for example. Usually the Longobard king adopted the widows, the orphans, to increase in this sense also the process of emancipation from the clans that, as we have seen, were were also the ones that maintained more of a more privatistic ideal that was in conflict a bit with public authority, but it was important for a king to present himself as also one that owned enough power and enough authority on that same traditional base to claim sovereignty because of that. So the mundoalt, so basically the man who owned the mundum, that is basically owned the control of the woman's or the child or the incapable, let's say, welfare in general, including possession, by the way, intervened at their side or on their behalf in the various juridical negotiations, as we were saying before. Now, what about the Roman population, right? Because we see these 100 or 300,000 Longobards that were also mixed enter Italy. They settle here in a population of millions. And what about the Romans? How did it happen? How did it become Longobard, right? So, as it was customary, when the Germans invaded a foreign land, a Roman land at this point, of course, they fundamentally were, by the international law, if such anachronism could be allowed to be defined, they were the winners, they were the conquerors, right? So whoever was basically, they could do whatever they wanted of the others. But as we've seen, when you are, let's say, 1 or 3 to 90, 99, 97, you can't really do that. So the Roman population was historically excluded by the use of arms. Also under the Ostrogoths, as we've seen, only the Germans made up the army, whereas, however, still the senators owned, an important amount of clienteles that could be even theoretically armed at some point. Well, at this point, the important was in a Longobard reality where properly now the Germans were just in charge themselves of the whole thing because of this substitution that we were talking about before. They, in theory, didn't have a political representation, right? The Romans were still ideally perceived as distinguished by the Longobard people army. That was literally the same thing because all adult mates were armed in a social, if not juridical, status of inferiority compared to the Germanic one. But the great mistake here to be done is that the Romans were never properly unfree. That is to say, when the Longobards arrived and found this Roman population, of course they thought, say, we are the rulers now, we are superior, but we don't have to confuse this with non-freedom, because the Romans were free, also for Longobards. In fact, we get it here. This is complicated. We'll have to make a video actually on a Rotary's edict, but there is properly a measure for which the Longobard kings, especially when they conquered certain Byzantine-held areas after a long time, such as Ravenna, especially in the late times, they became protectors both of the Longobards and the Romans on an equal juridical ground. What difference could there be in the 8th century, also from an ideological point of view, right? It's complex to tell, that is to say, which probably wasn't at all, right? But in theory, still, the Longobards were the rulers, right? Then there were the serfs, right? True. They could be both Romans and barbarians, right? There were also the Aldi, that were the half-free, or that is to say, kind of freedmen, that is free cum obsequio, that is to say, you had it's like the Roman freedmen, right? It was the same exact thing. They had certain codified duties towards the guy who had freed you, your former master. Well, what happened, simply enough, is that the Roman, let's say, transformation to Longobards was gradual but fast, right? Because initially, imagine the first generation, Longobards and Romans are initially distinguished, right? Socially, juridically, the two groups regulated their own right? Also physically, in the cities, as we were saying before at the beginning, the barbarians settled in certain quarters that were distant, or at least from the others, or at least from which they could control the whole urban center. It was a process of also fortification with the renewed a wave of wars against the Byzantines and so on. But it's obvious, as we were saying before, that the prolonged coexistence and the scarce number of the Longobards altogether favored this, let's say, process of closening, right? The contiguity of residence was strong, especially in the city. Here, the Longobards established in the old Roman buildings. They installed in their own local administration in the public palaces, starting from the seat of the duke, while the warriors with their families found their abodes in the adjacent houses. First in their, as we've seen, reserved quarters, then eventually more distributed in the rest of the city. And within the city walls, the Longobards were the minority. They had in front of them a Roman majority that was organized by the bishop and the Catholic clergy that still existed. Like, not all the Catholic bishops were taken out, actually. And who also were the depositories of a culture was more apt to a sedentary and city life, right? And they were also, the Longobards were, brought to daily contact with the Roman artisans and merchants, right? So in such conditions, it was impossible for a militarized minority, even if it owned ideally political power, to maintain for a long time its separation, right? There wasn't properly even a legislation that prohibited the contacts between the two peoples, and would have abated, right? And in fact, we have no evidence at all that this was done. No norm, for example, prohibited the mixed marriages, because still the Romans were freemen, the Longobards too, so they could marry into each other. It would be normal, right? They had all the interests, especially at an elite level. That was the one that was trying especially to strengthen the political control on the whole kingdom, etc. It was obvious that, if there were local well-off Romans, you would like to arrange a marriage with them. It would have brought more power, whatever, right? And the process fundamentally spread in the rest of the population. The same names are quite eloquent regarding to this. We find some Roman name here and there, but it's obvious that there are cases where you say that a Roman was called with a Germanic name. And this had to do sometimes with a juridical, also change that happened between the two. And it's not even true that probably the official Longobard conversion to Catholicism brought to finally the opening to the Romans. As we were saying before, we know it from archaeology that the Longobards began to produce art and things like the Romans did in the very first generations. So these people were blending together, and at the point that it wouldn't properly make sense, who also by the 7th century could tell how do you distinguish with a Roman with a Longobard, right? These were clientelary societies. What mattered is under whom you were just by default. So also, who cared what properly the individual could do or couldn't do, right? So during the 7th century, basically we see that any distinction between Longobards, Romans, in actual fact, finished, right? The Arianism was fully rejected in 653. Then the reabsorption of the Tricapitoline schism was in 698, right? This cultural actually evolution is confirmed also by the abandonment, as we were seeing at the end of the 7th century, of the use of funerary, let's say, objects, demonstrating that the pagan background of the Longobards had fundamentally diluted. It was fundamentally anachronistic, right, for that new social system and group identity to go on with those. It didn't make sense, right? There are other elements. The commixtion of names, as we were saying, the Roman and of Christian tradition for the same Longobards, right? Germanic names for the Romans, as we were saying before, and the sharing of the same language. These people spoke the same language. With the 8th century, Longobard seems to have disappeared from its usage. So by the 8th century, during reigns such as the one of Liutprand, who was the greatest Longobard king, on which we will come back at some point, the surpassing of boundaries, not just cultural ones, but also juridical ones, was completed, right? Society in the kingdom, we see it from legal practice, showed a new physiognomy. It wasn't like, this separation was not properly perceived, contemplated, right? And when people say, but still in the 8th century you see that in the laws there is the difference between Longobards and Romans. Yes, there is. But the Romans they're talking about there are basically the ones that, in fact, those laws were issued after the conquest of the Exarchate, right? And where there were also lots of merchants that began to make a lot of business with the Longobards that now ruled there. So those were still technically Romans because they had inhabited always in areas that had remained Roman throughout all the Byzantine control. So those were true Romans in a juridical sense. But we see in Longobard practice something so simple and intelligent, after all, that if a Roman and a Longobard wanted to make a contract, or even a Frank, because there were foreigners as well in that sense, they could choose freely whether they wanted to use the Roman or the Germanic formula, for example. Even if the guys were not, let's say, 2 Romans wanted to make a Germanic contract, it's legal for Longobard law. The same goes to 2 Longobards want to make a contract under Roman law, they can. It's legal as well. And properly, we don't see, the main indicators that we see, of course, in the legal practice, in the trials, in the contracts, in the testaments, and all this stuff, that properly there's no difference of sort. You don't spot anybody says, this is a Roman, so we can't, this is a problem, this guy can't do that. No, there's none of that, right? And especially what really is shown there is that everybody is a Longobard. That is, Romans properly are not there. Longobards are, Romans are just people like, okay, they came from the outside. They came from the Byzantine part. They are from, or people from other countries. Within the Longobard Kingdom, everybody's a Longobard by then. So, as it's obvious, just by sheer demographic and cultural weight, right? This was, as we've seen, a minority of pagan people that entered some of the most advanced areas in the world at the time, and they were obviously, integrated, assimilated into it, right? All right, so I would say for today we stop here, right? We will talk a lot about Longobards again, right? Because this is really important to understand well, right? And there is actually so much to say. Today even we just began to scratch the surface, because if we really want to be correct, you have to look at all the various examples I'm talking about. So now I think like I made 14 videos about Longobards, but there is a playlist about them proper. But there is further to say, really. And okay, we will hopefully. So I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.